hppodcraft.com.
Look about you, Clark. You see the mountain and hill following after hill as wave on wave. You see the woods and orchard, the fields of ripe corn and the meadows reaching to the reed beds by the river. You see me standing here beside you and hear my voice. But I tell you that all these things, yes, from that star that has just shone out in the sky to the solid ground beneath our feet, I say that all these are but dreams and shadows, the shadows that hide the real world from our eyes. There is a real world, but it is beyond this glamour and this vision, beyond these chases and auras, dreams and a career, beyond them all, as beyond a veil. I do not know whether any human being has ever lifted that veil, but I do know, Clark, that you and I shall see it lifted this very night from before another's eyes. You may think this all strange nonsense. It may be strange, but it is true, and the ancients knew what lifting the veil means. They called it seeing the god Pan.
That is one of the beginning paragraphs from Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan.
That's right, and we are covering that story here at the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
At hppodcraft.com.
I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
And I'm Chris Lackey. Chad, why are we covering an Arthur Machen story on the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast?
Well, Chris, because for some time now we've been covering other authors besides H.P. Lovecraft. These are authors that he held in high regard and stories that he spoke about in his essay on weird fiction called Supernatural Horror and Literature. I didn't realize until the last few years since we were doing this podcast, but it is one of the classics of horror literature. Lovecraft talks about this story at length, although Stephen King has also cited it as one of the best in English literature.
Referenced in Just After Sunset, which was a collection of his, that he says this story of Arthur Machen's surmounts its rather clumsy prose and works its way relentlessly into the reader's terror zone. How many sleepless nights has it caused? God knows. A few of them were mine. I think Pan is as close to the horror genre comes to a great white whale. He loves it.
Yeah, and in another interview, he said it's one of the best horror stories ever written, maybe the best in the English language. I don't know if I would go that far after having given this a second read before to prep for the show. I agree more when he says that it is rather clumsy prose. But there are things about it that are difficult to understand and comprehend just on a quick read. You have to really dig in and unpack things to make sure that you understand what's going on. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing.
No.
He is right in that it gradually gets to you. It is a scary story.
Yeah.
And if you really give it the focus that it deserves, it'll pay off. Now, Lovecraft and supernatural horror and literature had a few things to say. First, about Arthur Machen, he said, of living creators of cosmic fear raised to its most artistic pitch, few, if any, can hope to equal the versatile Arthur Machen, author of some dozen tales, long and short, in which the elements of hidden horror and brooding fright attain an almost incomparable substance and realistic acuteness. Lovecraft goes on to say some more about this particular story in Supernatural Horror, and we'll get to that after we've kind of talked through.
Yeah, I think it's better to cover the story, and then we will go to Lovecraft and see what he had to say about it.
Right, but let's talk a little bit about Arthur Machen. Now, we've discussed him in past episodes when we were covering Lovecraft, because there's certain pieces of Machen's work that are often cited when talking about the Dunwich Horror or Cool Air or the Festival, things that Lovecraft kind of cribbed from. And I think Robert Price, when he did our Dunwich Horror episodes, flat out said he thought that the Dunwich Horror was sort of a retelling of The Great God.
Yeah, or a pastiche, I think is the word he uses. Yeah, it could have been intentionally his version of The Great God Pan.
Right.
There's a lot more action in Lovecraft's version of it, but it's still, there's a lot of similarities. And we'll talk, I think if we talk about that after we cover the story, then we can point out those things.
And I wanted to talk about Machen for a minute, because while we touched on some of his biographical details in those episodes, there's really a lot of interesting stuff in his life. He was born in Wales in 1863 and eventually moved to London, where he worked initially. He was just looking for work of any kind. And for a good amount of time, he worked in different editing jobs and as a translator.
Yeah.
But he had a lot of jobs. In 1887, he got kind of some backhanded luck. His father died within a month of him getting married. I don't remember if it was before or after, but his father died, and he was, with the inheritance that he received, he was able to kind of do his own thing for the next 15 years. So he didn't have to scrounge around and get day jobs. He could just write.
Yeah.
Because of that, it gave him a little space to write what he wanted instead of writing for the markets at the time. So he wrote The Great God Pan.
Yep.
Was one of the first things that he did, which he could do because he didn't have to worry about whether people read it or not, which is kind of why it's so out there. And he also wrote a novel anthology hybrid called The Three Imposters. And that's the one that's got all those novels in it. Novel meaning story, the novel of the Black Seal, that kind of thing. Now, Great God Pan created a real sensation when it came out, but it was almost universally panned by critics.
Yeah.
Like, people did not like it. Actually, later in the 1920s, Machen published a lot of the most hostile reviews that he'd received in his autobiography. But he released a whole book called Precious Balms that it had nothing but bad reviews in it of his work. A lot of them for The Great God Pan. And I totally get that. I still keep a huge file of rejection letters that I got when I was initially sending out my novel Children in Heat. I mean, there's just something, you want to keep that stuff. Maybe it's because you think later you'll be mad. But, he was already well successful when he published this book, Precious Balms. So I don't know what he was trying to do. I think it's funny.
Yeah. Well, now this is interesting. And in 1899, his wife died of cancer, and she was sick for a long time. And it sort of really destroyed him because he was very close to his wife. And he started getting into, this is the crazy stuff. He got into the Order of the Golden Dawn. Do you know what that is? That's the Hermetic Order.
Is that Aleister Crowley?
Yes. Thing? Yeah. Well, Aleister Crowley, I think, started it, and then they kicked him out because he was too wacky. They did. And so they became different branches. They kept splitting up, but it was a mystic order that studied magic and Hermetic things and stuff like that. So he joined that for a while. But didn't really get into it. It's just something he was trying to do to get over his wife. Yeah.
I didn't know that. I know that he was pretty staunchly Catholic later in life, and that he always had a preference for mysticism over, materialism.
Yeah.
Just as an aesthetic. But I had no idea that he was getting into this occult business.
Oh,
That's
he did.
Great.
Yeah. And then after that, he decided he wanted to get into acting.
Right. That was, things were drying up in his inheritance when Amelia died. He needed work. And so for about 8 years, he worked as an actor in a Shakespearean company.
Yeah, he toured. He toured all around England and Wales and Scotland and stuff.
Which is pretty cool. He got remarried after that. Eventually, he started working as a journalist, writing for all sorts of publications. In 1910, he settled into a job as a reporter for the London Evening News.
Yeah.
Where this really odd thing happened, almost a Orson Welles' War of the World kind of thing.
Yeah.
In 1914, he wrote this story called The Bowmen. This was obviously the war had just broken out, and people were pretty shocked by the amount of casualties and the sorts of things that were going on in the trenches. And this story was about the ghosts of medieval British archers coming to the assistance of a group of World War I soldiers who were pinned down in the trenches. And since he published it in the Evening News, people sort of thought it was real. And pretty soon there were people coming forth to give eyewitness accounts of it happening. Some other people wrote pamphlets authenticating it. I mean, it was total madness. It took Machen forever to convince people that it was just a story.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. It's crazy how people just will latch onto this. I mean, we talk about urban myths a lot on the show. I mean, it's that whole thing with the escaped cougar, and that there was. Did I mention that on the show? Yeah, that there was an escaped lion supposedly in England around here.
No.
Yes. Still,
really?
Still, it's going on, and it was, and all it is eyewitness accounts. There's no footprints. There was no reported escape from any zoo or any place anywhere because it wasn't real. But it was on the flippin' BBC. They had people talking, going, "Oh yeah, I saw it first. I thought it was maybe a dog or something, and I realized it wasn't a dog. It was a mountain lion." And can't believe you're reporting this.
I love it. Well, the fact that he had medieval British archers coming to help them out, that's a commonality in a lot of Machen's work. He was really influenced by the mysticism of his Welsh, heritage. Even though he lived in London most of his life, he really had a fondness for his home. And also that kind of Roman British lore that we find its way into The Great God Pan, that there were these sort of pre-monotheistic rites happening in certain places in the British Isles.
Right.
So I think that all syncs up, but that's pretty cool. Now, in the 1920s, there was a publisher that took on Machen's work here in America and started putting it out in various anthologies, and that was when Lovecraft read it. When a couple of anthologies came out in 1923 and 1924 that turned Lovecraft onto Machen. And right after he had read that stuff, that's when he wrote stories like Cool Air and The Festival of the Dunwich Horror. Now, the first chapter that we're about to jump into in The Great God Pan, I mean, I thought that he'd taken From Beyond, he had just ripped it off completely from this story when I first read it a couple of years ago, The Great God Pan. As I was doing the research for this, I realized that From Beyond was written in 1920. And most of the information that I've gotten that we've been talking about here, I got from S.T. Joshi's foreword to his edition, his annotated edition of The Great God Pan, which Larry Roberts from Bloodletting Press was very kind and sent you and I both copies of that. That's the reason I have it.
It's a beautiful book. Everybody should own it.
It's a gorgeous book. And if you want to patronize Larry's store, you can go to miskatonicbooks.com. And I did just check in. They have, I think, the paperback edition of this there. So you can get it for less than $20. The intro that Joshi wrote was really fantastic, and it does help to have his annotations as you're going through the text. It also contains the full text of the three imposters, among other great Mac and weird tales. So I would recommend checking that out, and thanks once again to S.C. Joshi for all of his great research. But as I was saying, the anthologies that turned Lovecraft onto Mackin were written in 23, 24, so it was after he'd already written From Beyond.
Wow, okay, good. Yeah, I kind of always thought that myself, that it was his take on it, but obviously it wasn't. They just happened to the same wavelength.
Very much so, the same wavelength, because in From Beyond we've got this crazy researcher who's saying there's this other world beyond that we can't see, but he's invented this machine that stimulates a part of your brain, the pineal gland, and if that gets stimulated, you're able to perceive that stuff. And that is more or less exactly the premise of the first chapter of The Great God Pan, called The Experiment.
Let's get into it then.
Now, the first excerpt that we heard at the beginning of the show was by reader Andrew Lehman.
Yeah.
Who thankfully is back to guide us through this one. It's probably going to be a multi-part episode thing. Just seemed like Lehman could really kill this, which he is doing so far.
We're somewhere in a distant house, like a big mansion somewhere. They're very vague about where this is, and there's two guys talking. It's Clark and Raymond. Now, Raymond is a doctor, and he was the guy that was talking. That's who we heard, and he was talking to Clark. And he talks about, he's got this theory, and because he's super into transcendental medicine. That's like his thing.
So some kind of supernatural science.
Right. And he's had this theory for like 20 years, but in the last 5 years, he's figured out a way to prove it. And he's kind of explaining to Clark what this other world is, that there is this world that exists outside of our world, and that we could perceive it if only our brain were slightly different, and that there's a procedure you can do with this tiny little cut in the brain that will allow people to see it.
And that, now, it is subtly different from Lovecraft's From Beyond, where those things that we see, he doesn't allude to them being of this world or kind of like interdimensional. There might be there's something kind of offensive about whatever it is that we see in From Beyond, whereas here, this is nature in some kind of
filtered way.
Exactly. It's if he can reveal this to you, you're going to see the forces of nature at work somehow. Something, it's awful because it's not what we're meant to see, but it's also kind of part of the natural world in a way.
And Clark says, surgery's kind of extreme. Is that completely necessary? And he says, yes, it's totally necessary because it's the only way it's going to work. I've tested it. I know what I'm doing, and I have a willing participant, somebody that is, which I'm like, oh, okay, that sounds pretty strange. He has this young girl, Mary. He says, Mary, come on in, and you're going to see Pan tonight. You're going to see the great god Pan. Which, when he says that, he doesn't necessarily mean a literal god Pan. He just means he's going to see into this ultimate nature.
Right. But you say willing participant. She's definitely willing to follow the doctor, but I don't know if she has a good idea of what's about to happen to her.
Oh, no, I wouldn't say at all.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say, of course she doesn't. But she trusts this doctor because, and he says, I rescued Mary from the gutter and from almost certain starvation when she was a child. I think her life is mine to use as I see fit. It's like, what?
Well, that's when this thing takes a left, and it happens pretty quick. It takes a left turn from this mad scientist, because it's got that mad scientist kind of thing at the beginning, right? I can show you things, and I've come up with stuff. But when he introduces this woman who's essentially his slave.
Yeah.
And his rationale is simply that she was poor when he found her.
Yeah.
So because he got her out of that condition, then he's allowed to use her as a lab rat. It's super misogynistic, and it's really off-putting. It's the first time that I started to feel really bad as I was reading the story. What are they going to do?
Yeah. No, this reminded me of, my wife was just telling me about John Watson. He was a psychiatrist guy at the turn of the century, and he was doing these horrible tests on children. And it was, at the time, people didn't seem to care too much that he was doing these things. But one of his experiences was with baby Albert, and now my son's name is Albert. So it hits a little close to home for me.
Yeah.
He would show this baby a little fuzzy a rat, a little cute fuzzy white rat. And every time the child would look at the rat or touch the rat, he would bang these two metal pipes behind the child and make him cry. And he kept doing this until the child would freak out just seeing the rat. And he also, this guy, John Watson, not to be confused with Sherlock Holmes, John Watson.
I wasn't confused about that, by the way.
He had this whole theory about withholding affection from your children to make them more proficient in jobs and careers and things like that. And to test this, he gave one of his children lots of attention and affection, and one of them he withheld attention and affection for his own children, and it screwed them up. Obviously, it screwed up both of them. Like the one that got the attention was kind of a jerk because he got all this kind of unwarranted attention, and the one that didn't was the shell of a man who ended up killing himself soon after his father died. It's so horrible. It's good now that ethics are much more important in research and medicine than, I mean, I think there's obviously still ways to go. People could be more ethical, and I think that's always something to be put forward. But I think at the time, doing things like this probably wasn't that unethical, or at least it wasn't frowned upon as it was as much now. But I think it still was.
Yeah, I think this is still kind of a criminal act in a way. I think that there's a point of view that Machen is trying to put forth, actually. And it's funny because most of the story is completely supernatural. It's completely in the romantic tradition in a way, in that like things are happening that are, well, supernatural. But here it's science that causes all the ruin to happen, though, right? It's this guy overreaching in a scientific practice that causes the evil to come forth. Mm-hmm. And I think that he's purposely making the scientist very callous and a bad person.
Yeah.
Because this is how he views the entire practice of science. The author, he's somebody that seeks the mysticism of the world, and as we said a second ago, and he just wasn't particularly fond of science and materialism.
Yeah. When
he brings Clark, he says, "Let's go inside and get this experiment going." He brings Clark in there, and there's a chair set up, which in my head I was imagining like a dentist's chair. I doubt that's really what it looks like.
Oh, I thought in my head I pictured it more of like an executioner's electric chair for some reason. I don't know why I did that either.
Well, it's described as an odd-looking chair.
Yeah.
That's it. Those are two odd-looking chairs, so it makes sense. But it's got a footrest. We know that, too. So maybe it's more like a barber's chair, because he can raise and lower it and all that kind of... Yeah, I think this is like a barber's chair. So he sits a woman where he's going to put her in there, but first he's got to mix up some formulas.
Yes.
Which is awesome. I love it when scientists mix formulas. Did you ever spend time doing that when you were a little kid?
Oh, my gosh. All the time. I'd take all types of stuff in the kitchen and mix it together and try and make a formula that would give me superpowers. And, of course, it just made me sick.
Just made you sick.
Yeah.
It's just fruit cocktail and ice cream and maybe some orange juice.
Oh, yeah. Pepper and Tabasco sauce and all that stuff.
Right.
Yeah. The more disgusting it sounded, the more likely I thought it would give me some kind of added benefit. And of course it didn't.
Well, you would be that one kid who nobody else thought of putting, chipped beef and Windex together. You're the guy that did that, and now you have heat vision.
I didn't do Windex. I was smart enough not to put anything toxic in there.
Most of the time I spent with just pouring fluid from one glass to another. Like the mixing process was really...
Yeah, that was fun.
Anyway, so Dr. Raymond, he puts a couple of things together, and the smell that comes out suddenly makes Clark kind of get into this drifty dream state, thinking about a day 15 years before when he'd spent roaming the woods and meadows near his own home. So even whatever this PrEP serum is,
it's kind of taking him into nature and opening up his mind to this hyper nature, this hyper reality. He's at his father's house and he's in the woods. The woods are more beautiful and there's the smell of summer and it's amazing. But then he encounters this, he says, he's face to face with a presence that was neither man nor beast, neither the living nor the dead, but all things mingled, the form of all things, but devoid of all form.
Little foreshadowing.
Yeah, but then it says to him, "Let us go hence." And then he trips out into the darkness beyond the stars, whatever that means. And then he wakes up.
Yeah, he wakes up and Raymond's like, "Oh, you're a little tired. You must have drifted off, sleepy baby. I'm going to go get Mary. I'll be right back." Clark's a little weirded out. He brings the girl in. She's about 17, dressed all in white, and she's really attractive.
Yeah.
Dr. Raymond says to her, "Are you willing to trust yourself to me entirely?" She says, "Yes, dear."
Creepy.
It's really creepy. He brags. "You hear that, Clark? Haha. Here's the chair." She asks for a kiss before they start.
And he kisses her on the mouth. Oh, so creepy.
So gross, man. There's something about it, too, I imagine. And Raymond's quite a lot older than her, I imagine, too. And
I'm guessing, yeah.
I don't like what he's doing. And then, so this thing happens. Clark is kind of watching. He waves that whatever he just mixed up, he kind of places it under her nostrils, and she gets really pale, starts to struggle a little, and then kind of gets submissive and still, and then unconscious. So Dr. Raymond then comes over to the chair, lets the back down, cuts away a circle from her hair, And then he takes a little instrument from his case, and Clark turns away because he doesn't want to see him bang into her skull and remove parts of her brain after giving her a kiss. Some lobotomy action. And then after a few moments pass, they sit there waiting, clock ticking.
Suddenly, as they watched, they heard a long-drawn sigh. And suddenly did the color that had vanished return to the girl's cheeks, and suddenly her eyes opened. Clark quailed before them. They shone with an awful light, looking far away, and a great wonder fell upon her face, and her hands stretched out as if to touch what was invisible. But in an instant the wonder faded, and gave place to the most awful terror. The muscles of her face were hideously convulsed. She shook from head to foot. The soul seemed struggling and shuddering within the house of flesh. It was a horrible sight, and Clark rushed forward as she fell shrieking to the floor. 3 days later, Raymond took Clark to Mary's bedside. She was lying wide awake, rolling her head from side to side and grinning vacantly. "Yes," said the doctor, still quite cool. "It is a great pity. She is a hopeless idiot. However, it could not be helped, and, after all, she has seen the great god Pan."
What a jerk.
I know. It's terrible. Here's my question.
Yeah.
He has no proof that she saw the great god Pan.
How does he know that at all?
For all he knows, he just gave her some terrible brain surgery, and she's just Jack Nicholson at the end of Cuckoo's Nest now. That's it.
Yeah. I have a lot of questions about this first chapter. Like, how did he know that cutting a part of a person's brain would enable them to see the great god Pan? There had to be some kind of process to get you to this place. Was it maybe this drug that put her out?
Well, it's whatever he does, it's to her brain. And he does say to Clark, he says something like, "I don't want to bother you with shop, Clark. I might give you a massive technical detail, which would sound very imposing and would leave you as enlightened as you are now. Basically, you'd never understand what I'm doing." It's also a great way to sweep away the questions that you were just asking.
Right. Exactly. It's a science fiction or a horror story, so you shouldn't really have to ask too many questions. But I feel like there should have been something that, how does he know all of these things? What clued him into this concept? And I thought that would have been an interesting thing to understand why he's doing this thing. Does he hope to eventually have himself see into this? I
don't know, but I was thinking that Crawford Tillinghast is a heck of a lot more brave than this guy, because he took on his first test subject was himself. He didn't hurt some harmless girl to find out if his machine worked. He did kill his servants, but that was just kind of a side effect.
That was an accident. He didn't really mean it. He told them to be quiet.
Exactly. But yeah, I don't know what the result is that he even hopes for exactly.
It's strange.
He's like, "Clark, I proved with what we've done today that I can destroy a girl's life. Science will forever appreciate my genius."
About Clark, like, who's this guy that he's just not telling anybody about this? He's not going to the authorities going, "Yeah, I know this guy, friend of mine, kind of more of acquaintance, really, has this young girl living with him and just did some brain surgery on her, made her into an idiot." You might want to, I don't know, check on his credentials or make sure that he's sane and not just doing horrible things to people for no good reason.
Well, we do learn in later chapters that Clark is, you would think he would do that, even despite what we learn about him, which is that he has a kind of morbid fascination with mysteries that can't be explained, even though most of the time he's kind of a sensible guy. But even so, you would think he'd have some kind of morality.
What kind of mystery has been, this isn't mysterious. This is a guy who says, "Hey, I'm going to do some brain surgery on this girl so she can see other things that we can't." Oh, she's an idiot, but trust me, it worked.
She's lucky.
What? No, that's horrible. You just did a horrible thing right there.
It's so awesome. You know, one thing I wanted to point out before we bring this to a close, in that paragraph that Andrew read at the very beginning, there's a quote. It says, "There is a real world, but it is beyond this glamour and this vision behind these chases and heiress dreams in a career."
Oh, yeah.
Chases and heiress dreams in a career. That is a couple of clips from a poem called Dotage by George Herbert, who is a Welsh poet, wrote that in 1633. Interesting, that poem was included in a collection called The Temple.
Oh.
Just a coincidence, but
could be, maybe not.
We're a Lovecraft show.
We didn't even say that, Arthur Macken's name wasn't really Arthur Machen, by the way. Arthur Llewellyn Jones, because it's a Welsh name. Llewellyn? Maybe it's pronounced Llewellyn. Arthur Llewellyn Jones.
So what a liar. One last question I had about this, Chris. Maybe you can sort this out for me.
Mm-hmm.
And this happens a lot in the story where things are almost said and then not completed. It leaves a little mystery there. Clark and Dr. Raymond, when they're outside and they're still discussing about the procedure they're about to do, Raymond has just said, Clark, Mary will see the god Pan. Clark turns to him and says, but you remember what you wrote to me? I thought it would be requisite that she... And he doesn't finish the statement. He whispered the rest into the doctor's ear. The doctor responds and says, not at all, not at all. That is nonsense. I assure you, indeed, it is better as it is. I'm quite certain of that. What the hell are they talking about?
I don't know, but what I suspect, maybe that she a virgin?
I thought maybe it had something to do with that. In fact, that's probably exactly what it is. I thought it would be requisite that she...
Be a virgin?
Be a virgin? Is that what he's saying?
I'm thinking, and then Raymond is like, oh, I've been banging her, and then that's
what it is, isn't it?
So if she's been getting banged, then she's going to be more open to this stuff. That's what I took out of it. But I mean,
your literary scholar analysis of it is that she's getting banged, and if she's getting banged.
Hey, we're just some pals hanging out here, Pfeiffer.
I know, we are.
That's it. This is how we talk. This is
a
how
couple old
talk.
soldiers. This is how people talk. Well, he's saying, I think that's what it is. He's saying, you think she should be a virgin? The doctor's saying, nah, it's fine. I've been getting up in that. But then he says something might go wrong. You would be a miserable man for the rest of your... So I thought that perhaps the doctor had gotten her pregnant.
Oh, yeah, that could definitely be it, because that does play into the rest of the story.
Yes. And then the rest of the story, though, most things that I've read about it, they say it's more like the Dunwich Horror, where it's like this alien being is kind of what did it. It was Pan.
Yeah.
But I thought maybe she was already pregnant with the doctor's kid.
Could be.
And then it just got into the baby or something. But, okay, well, I don't know. Maybe folks can chime in on that, and we could come back to the next few chapters with some opinions from others. So we'll be back next time with more on the Great God Pan. There's how many chapters are in this thing total?
8, I think.
We'll speed through a couple of more of them, but
we'll go
it's a really
faster.
cool story, and there's lots to discuss with it. And I do want to say thanks, everybody, for being patient with us during the recent feed troubles.
Sorry
and as
about
we
that.
moved over to the server. Sorry about that. We're a small shop, so when these things come up, we got to kind of scramble around to make sure they get solved. I really appreciate people being patient and writing in and going back and forth with us as we try to get this thing running like a smooth ship runs.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
We're getting there, though, and it's pretty good. And, tell your friends and neighbors if they want to hear more on our coverage of the Great God Pan to tune in. After that, I think we're going to get into, we were talking today about maybe doing the Willows next.
Algernon Blackwood. That should be pretty great. Also, I want to thank Andrew Lehman for his dulcet tones, making me feel so darn scared. Thank you, Andrew.
Andrew, thanks. He's going to be with us throughout this voyage, and hopefully we'll have him back again sometime soon for another time machine.
Time machine, yes. Actually, I would like him to talk about the 1920s, which is something I know he knows a lot about.
We're going to do that soon. So subscribe, tell your friends and neighbors. Thanks, everybody, for supporting us, and thanks for your patience again. I am Chad Pfeiffer, concluding for now.
And I'm Chris Lackey, and you are listening to the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
At hppodcraft.com.
hppodcraft.com.
brain.